as it were, God helps us to flourish in this life. This is a help to humanity. And I think, the issue really for me in this conclave has not been where we talk about left and right and liberals and conservatives. It's actually been about how the church relates to the world. In a way, it's the old question of the Second Vatican Council. Does the church, as it were, take refuge in its own institution and wait for people to come to it and preach, as it were, from a place of privilege and power? Or, as Francis believed, is this a church that starts from below, from a place of humility, and goes out to people? To take the church to the people was always his vision. The reason that Francis startled us in 2013 was that almost everything about him communicated this new style.
Yeah.
The approachability, the directness, the
Press
warmth, the
conferences on
humanity,
planes and so on.
the freewheeling nature of his relationship with the press. It's very hard now to imagine the next Pope reversing that, but it is possible. And therefore, I think who comes out on that balcony, I certainly, in a way, I think our first reactions are going to be, is he going to continue to be that sort of Pope? Or is this actually a course correction, an attempt to some extent recover what Francis broke through?
But you know this as well as anyone, I suspect, that Francis had charisma. He could pull that off. He could have that impromptu press conference on an aeroplane and talk about the relationship of the church to the LGBTQ community.
Clive, here's the secret I'm going to let you into. In 2012, Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio's reputation was of a rather dour man and an introvert. After he was elected, the one thing that the Argentine bishops used to say to him is, Jorge, what the heck happened to you? And he would say, it's the grace of the office. He gave almost no interviews.
Yeah.
And this is what we have to remember. The person that's been elected might be actually a fairly introverted, shy person. But as Pope, he will need to be different. Because nowadays a Pope has to be able to relate to crowds, travel the world, and have that charism. But charism means gift.
Yes.
And as I said earlier, the assumption is that, as it were, God, the Holy Spirit, will give the Pope the gifts that he needs, building on his own natural gifts, to perform the mission of St. Peter that Jesus entrusted to St. Peter. So, we will probably see, whoever comes out on that balcony, we will probably make an instant judgment and say he's got a reputation for this, that and the other, he's a bit this, he's a bit that, and then watch while he then surprises us.
The office transforms the individual. The office changes them.
Exactly right. And it did Francis. And he was very straight about it. He said, it's the grace of the office. He would laugh about it. But, the idea that he would become this, as you say, freewheeling, funny, spontaneous, direct. he was always focused, energetic. He was always missionary. But in a way, the charism of Francis was very much a gift.
Yeah. Aleem, looking at, we've talked a little bit about the intre, we've talked about how perhaps the new pontiff will try to continue the legacy of Francis. The fact is, we are living in a much more secular age. How does the new leader of the Roman Catholic Church handle that particular situation?
Well, Pope Francis was one of those who wanted to reach out to people on the peripheries of the faith, but also beyond it as well. It was a hugely consequential 12 years or so of his papacy. Certainly, there will be those who think, because of the impact he's had over the last 12 years in this way of reaching out, he was, for some people, even outside the faith, a bit of a rock star because of the causes he chose to champion, the environment and poverty and being anti-war. But there were those, his fiercest critics were within the faith, very close to him in some cases. He had open spats with some of the cardinals who actually didn't really like what they saw as a bit of cult of personality. So I think a lot of people are looking at this as a bit of a referendum on the last 12 years. He had a vision on how to reach out to a world that wasn't necessarily, particularly in Europe, one that was as religious as it has been in the past. He had his ideas of doing that. This, and who ends up stepping out on that balcony, is going to be something of a referendum on whether the cardinals felt he was successful in doing that or not.
Yes, Austin, there were those suggestions, weren't there, that there were splits, that there were factions within the Curia, that there were suggestions that there were people who were implacably opposed to what Francis seemed to be doing. Has all that gone? Has all that melted away now?
Well, that's not new in the church. People feel strongly about things. There was a group of people that from the beginning were deeply suspicious of Francis. If you like, if you have a mentality where you see the church to some extent at war with the modern world or a refuge from it, you probably didn't like Francis, because he started with this joy, this basic idea that humanity, is good. And so I think people wanted, if you like, a bit more of the stern kind of teacher of previous popes. But, ultimately, the church is concerned with evangelization. This is the big thing that it does. How does it proclaim to the world? Now, we've been talking about secularization. The truth is, secularization is complex. On the one hand, we have a very sharp decline in Europe of people who are what we might call cultural Catholics, who grew up Catholic, who inherited their identity through their family. They are drastically dropping. But we have this new people now joining the church. 10,000 became Catholic in Paris over Easter, for example. Sometimes described as the seekers and the searchers. People coming from a non-religious background who are becoming Catholic in their 20s and 30s. We're going through what Francis called a change of era. And one of the important things about this conclave is that I hope anyway, and I hope that it produces a Pope who really understands this shift and understands that what Francis was doing was essential to evangelizing this era we're now in.
But that is critical, isn't it? That's critical to the future of the church.
It's absolutely critical. I mean, we can discuss lots and lots of issues, but ultimately the church is in the business of evangelization, and the Pope is the evangelizer in chief. He has also to be a statesman. We have to imagine him dealing with world leaders. He also has to be a good governor of this place, of the Curia. He has to be lots of things. But firstly, he's an evangelizer in chief. He has to capture people's hearts. And the wonderful funeral oration of Cardinal Ray at the funeral of Francis, the first half of it was actually all about that. It was about how Francis could awaken in people's hearts, even people a long way from faith, a sense of goodness, a sense of responsibility. That is a huge achievement, and I know the cardinals will want to build on that. They don't want to lose that in this next pontificate. That's why it's fascinating to know who's in there right now, waiting to come out.
But it also explains the speed as well, surely, that at least 2/3 have come to those conclusions as well, that they understand the issues, they understand the problems, and that added to the sense of urgency might be the wrong word, but the sense of, we've got to get this thing done.
Yeah, I mean, I'd use the word decisiveness. I think and of course it's very important. My first reaction when I saw the white smoke, this stage in the day, was actually one of relief. They've been decisive. They've managed to come round the next Pope. And he will be the fruit of a fairly rapid consensus. And that's a good sign. It's always a good sign.
Some in the crowd there with their hands clasped together, awaiting the name of the new man who will lead them for the next few years at least. Aline.
Well, just to say, there were 15,000 people in the square at the moment. White smoke billowed out of Sistine Chapel. The Sistine Chapel, we're now up to nearly 50,000 we hear, and you just know that all the streets around here are already now full, but that signal that the white smoke gave for people to pour into the square has been heard, and it's already filled up in every direction that we can see, but we know that beyond that, people are still pouring into the square. This is a hugely consequential moment, as we say, for all of these people here, for the Catholic Church around the world, but on the global stage.
Just looking at those pictures, all those flags from
Brazil,
everywhere. Venezuela as well, I think. Canada, of course. Catholics united for now, seemingly.
One of the
at this moment.
so-called papabile is a Canadian, the Archbishop of Quebec, Gérard Lacroix. They will, of course, be delighted if they have the first Canadian Pope.
An American Pope, perhaps?
We have, for the first time, the very real possibility of an American Pope, Cardinal Robert Prevost, who has, in fact, spent much of his life in Peru and Rome, but indeed Chicago-born. To have a Pope speaking speaking with an American accent, with a Chicago accent, to America at this time, could be fascinating.
There was also always a sense, wasn't there, that perhaps because of America's outsized position in the world, economically, militarily, and so on, that it didn't necessarily the church didn't necessarily need a voice to come from that part of the world.
Well, I think it worked the other way. I think the assumption was you couldn't have a pope of a superpower.
Right.
Because to some extent the pope always, as it were, challenges a superpower. However, I think that logic has changed now because of what's been happening in America. And many of the cardinals kept saying to us in the last couple of weeks, nationality in this conclave doesn't matter. If it's the right man, then he could be from anywhere.
It's about reaching out. It's about evangelizing, as you were saying. It's about trying to bring more into the fold.
Or rather, to start with the proclamation that Francis always started it, which was that God loves you and that you have a dignity. That's the first message. The rest, in a sense, follows on from that.
Ali?
Well, it's a lot to do with the personality of the man we'll see emerge from the balcony. Some have been seen much more as politicians. Some have been seen as theologians. Some as preachers and evangelists. All of that will be revealed shortly when we get the name of the cardinal who's won and the name they'll take as pope.
And as we see the American flag there in the crowd, South Africa next to it. Really quite extraordinary scenes. We are high up in our broadcasting position here above St. Peter's Square, but we can feel the electricity of this moment, the atmosphere, the joy, pure joy of these pilgrims, I suppose, greeting the news of a new pope. Hello to you. Welcome to the Vatican and St. Peter's Square here in the heart of Rome, where a new era is about to begin for the Roman Catholic Church. In the last hour, a successor to Pope Francis has been elected. White smoke was seen rising from a chimney high above the Sistine Chapel, much to the delight of the tens of thousands of people who'd gathered here, and indeed many millions around the world, watching this moment in history. Well, the 133 cardinal electors had finally found one among them to lead the Catholic Church, and we are still waiting to hear who that person actually is. Very shortly, we hope, he will be walking out onto the main balcony here above St. Peter's Square, just over my shoulder, to greet the crowds and to proclaim his papal name and to move forward with the church. Our religion editor, Ali Maqbool, is here with me. We didn't expect this to be so quick, did we?
No, and the drama of the moment really can't be understated. A serene, sunny, early evening in Rome just turned at the moment those first bits of white smoke started to emerge from the chimney of the Sistine Chapel. A buzz went through the crowd. It was a signal that a person had been chosen among the 133 inside the Sistine Chapel, that they'd come to a two-thirds majority. The bells of St. Peter's started to peal, which was the signal for anyone close to here to pour into the square to ultimately see the revelation of who had been chosen. We'll hear the papal name they will take. We'll hear about the direction that this church of 1.4 billion might take in the coming years, and of course who that new global voice will be. It has been an extraordinary 45 minutes or so since we saw the smoke emerge. We had bands process into the square, and as I say, tens of thousands now filling every street leading out of here.
But interesting as well for those people who are not sure of the choreography of all this, that we get the news that a pope has been chosen, but we don't know their name.
No, they have time to prepare. They're asked if they want to take up the role. They go into what's called the Room of Tears to get ready. They pray, they meditate if they want before that, but they get ready. And then we still won't see them immediately. We'll hear the protodeacon who will come out, first tell us the name of the cardinal who's been chosen, the name they choose to take as pope. They originally would take their own names, but then we had a pope, cardinal who named Peter, and he thought it might be a bit of an insult to be called Pope Peter again after the person considered by Catholics to be the first Pope, the Apostle of Jesus, Peter, after whom the basilica behind us is named, the square is named. And so that tradition of taking a different name of someone they admired, perhaps, as someone they wanted to emulate, was taken. So we will hear that, and it will be after that that we'll hear, we'll see the curtains part again, and we'll see the new Pope emerge.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Because lots of talk when the conclave began as to whether there were those who perhaps felt that perhaps Pope Francis had gone too far in their idea of what a liberal church should look like, that perhaps we might get a retrenchment, a move back. That belief, that fear, it doesn't feel as if those factions were there, because this decision came pretty quickly to find a 2/3 majority.
It's difficult to say until we see the person who emerges on that balcony, what was going on inside. But just to say that the conversations about who the Pope should be or what is needed by the Church and the world don't start when conclave starts. They were going on in this city, yes, informal meetings, but in coffees and dinners outside, as soon as we heard of the death of Pope Francis, and cardinals started to descend on Rome. And it was interesting to sample some of the thinking over that time. And even during those couple of weeks, there was a mood change. Even some of those who had been critical about what they saw as the radical nature at some points of the Pope Francis papacy still saw the way the crowd, for example, during the funeral responded to talk of the causes that Pope Francis had championed. They got to reflect on the impact that Pope Francis has had on the world, on the way the Church reached out, on being a voice for the voiceless. And there was some sense that actually there was an appreciation of that over the last couple of weeks, even from some of those who had criticised him. So the talk started to be of continuity, but perhaps with a way that brought everybody along, because there was a criticism of Pope Francis that he would go ahead and not necessarily spend too much effort in combating those who were opposed to his moves. So that was what the talk was, and perhaps that figure did emerge.
All right. Aleem, thank you for that. Aleem Maqbool, our religion editor there. You're watching BBC News.
You're watching BBC News. I'm Marianne Mashiri here at the Vatican, and we continue our live coverage of the announcement and election of a new Pope. You can see there the close-up shot of that famous St. Peter's Basilica balcony, the red velvet curtain draped across.
Main news tonight is that